Hello students, welcome. Today I am going to discuss the fourth lesson in the course on gender sensitization. Till now we have already seen different concepts related to gender. I have also spoken about the role of family, and then we looked at women in ancient India. So in this lesson I am going to look at women in medieval India. I have already shown you how it's a very patriarchal society in ancient India and what is the status of women, and the same thing continues in the medieval period also. And what we have done in history is there has been a neglect of gender as an analytical category, and it has had serious implications. We have when we look at the medieval period, there are certain ill-founded notions about individual women and women as a group, and these have gone unchallenged, and they are often constantly reinforced with constant reiteration, and this is something which continues throughout the medieval period. Though you had a large number of movements at this time, which brought in a lot of women into the forefront. And if you look at the bhakti movement, this was a period where they were demanding an equal society. They wanted everyone to be equal in the eyes of God, and you had a large number of women who became part of this movement. And you had Akka Mahadevi in 12th century. She was the daughter of a very rich merchant in Udutal in 12th century. She was a great devotee of Shiva, and she was known to be a very beautiful young woman, and the chieftain of the land, Kaushiki, fell in love with her and he wanted to marry her, and then she put up three promises in front of him that he would not touch her against his wishes. But when he does that, she leaves him and she walks out naked. Similarly, you had Lal Ded in Kashmir, during the 14th century. She was married at the age of 12 to another Brahmin family named Nika Bhatt. And then we have a number of legends which talk about the cruelty that was met out to her. And she also walks out naked. There are stories that, when she would dance, she would sing in a frenzy. And she came to be known as Lal Ded because the lower portion of her belly expanded to cover her private parts. Meera is a pan-Indian figure during 15th, 16th century. She is also, from Rajasthan. There were so many attempts at trying to murder her. They tried to kill her. Then you have another example of Sahajo Bai. She is born in 1765, and she also talks about her life as a woman. You have instances of Diwal Bai, Gauri Bai, who are, again from Gujarat. Then you have another saint called Ganga Sati, who is a poetess of Gujarat. So you have a large number of these women. In fact, from Maharashtra you have Jana Bai and Bahina Bai. So you have these women who had lot of difficulties after marriage. Their life was very smooth before they got married, but then after marriage they come into lot of issues with their in-laws family. There are attempts at trying to even kill them, because it is felt that the daughter-in-law brought a shame to these families. They get very restricted space in the matrimony, and what they did, they posited their relationship with God. They started looking upon God as their lover, their husband, their friend, and their mistress, as looking upon themselves as their mistress. And they created this space for themselves. In the religious field, they negotiated patriarchy in their own terms. And so, you have a very good example of many of these women in the Bhakti movement. I hope this is clear to you till now. And what I was trying to explain to you, how this whole movement, Bhakti movement, which is trying to bring about equality, they are questioning the Brahmin, the temples. It also created a certain space for women, and women could really do whatever they want. They could move out, they could sing hymns, they could compose based on this. But then when you come to the medieval period, look at the chronicles. When you have an individual woman like Razia Sultan, Minhajul Siraj in Tabqat-e Nasiri, he mentions about her. He says she is a wise and just, generous, a benefactor to her kingdom, a dispenser of justice, a protector of her subject, and a leader of her armies. She has all those qualities befitting a king, but she is not born of the right sex. So, being a woman was her biggest problem, and she was very capable. Iltutmish had nominated her as his successor because he saw his sons were good for nothing, and she had proved her worth and her capability as a military leader. And when she became the queen, she tried to offset the balance of the old amirs, and she had, she took the help of Yakut, who was an Abyssinian slave. And there are so many, stories written about her. It was her character which becomes very important. And they all said that, she comes to the court without covering her face. She had a relationship with Yakut. And that is what becomes very important in writing about history. Similarly, another very important woman which you have in medieval period is Noor Jahan. Many of the writings of this period represent her husband Jahangir as being effeminate or emasculated king. In fact, Vincent Smith goes to the extent of calling it a petticoat government, because she was the one who was, trying to, as he says, she is power hungry and manipulative. Now, what is interesting, if you look at the sultans of medieval period, I am sure you will all know that all of them were manipulative. There were so many wars, each one was power hungry. But when it comes to a women, we raise all these kinds of questions. So, women's manipulation gets much more serious attention than that of men. That is how many of the contemporary historians have treated Noor Jahan. But then when the woman is taking care of her son, when she acts as a regent, then she is not seen as being so much threatening, and she is applauded. You have examples of Chand Bibi, Rani Lakshmi Bai, where they were trying to combine the heroic valor with the resistance against the imperial power, and they were trying to protect the role, the throne for their sons. And this is how these women are represented as being very noble women. So, we have really not moved away from the patriarchal setup of how we judge women in history, and medieval history is a very interesting case in point. When the woman is fighting for herself, she is looked upon as being hungry, manipulative. When the woman is fighting for a husband, the husband is ridiculed, saying that he is it's a petticoat government, he is an emasculated king. But when the woman is in the role of a mother, she is trying to fight for her son, that woman is applauded. In fact, the medieval period becomes a very good peg to hang all kinds of evils in society. Whether we are talking in terms of child marriage, parda, sati, infanticide, all these are attributed to medieval period. And there is a false notion which is created saying that ancient India was a golden period. See, ancient India is also patriarchal, medieval period is also patriarchal. If you read Edward Said's Oriental Discourse, the Oriental Discourse centers on the idea of the other, the collective notion of identifying, the Europeans against the non-Europeans. And it is looked upon as European identity being very superior, and all non-European people are not superior. So, the whole discourse in these kinds of writing is, it's a very male based discourse, that opposition between East and West and the whole relationship of power. Syed argues that the Orient itself is a feminine culture. It has a resonance which signifies sexuality, both which is desired and feared in the Western imagination. And this is something which we can see when many of the men were writing about the harem. when the men were not allowed into the harem, there were strict rules of privacy, and women were kept behind screens. So they used the imagination, and they start talking about each king having 300 wives, and they are all staying in the harem. They looked upon the harem as a very sexualized space, without realizing that the harem is nothing but a domestic space. See, today we have families. In the family, there are so many people who live. Similarly, in the harem, you had aunts, you had mothers, you had sisters who were there, and it is not necessarily a sexualized space. But then many of these males, when they are looking upon them, they describe the harem in terms of exorcism, promiscuousness, and sexuality. There is also a very gendered notion of selfhood, because they are comparing to the Western women in terms of marriage, nature of domestic life. However, women were allowed into the harem. Many of these Western women entered these harem. But what is really interesting is they also come under that big imperial agenda that they are trying to uplift the cause of the imperial cause. And instead of analyzing the zanana as a prototype or the home space, they scrutinize it with reference to the whole family structure, how children are brought up in that space. They also give a lot of attention to the female body, and they look upon a lot of description of the oriental dress, dance, the kind of entertainment that is provided to them. They look at the sexual arrangement in the harem as especially polygamy. It comes as a shock to them, but they describe it. Now, what is interesting is you have the male gaze. I have already explained to you how the male gaze constructs the zanana or the harem as a site of sensuous and alluring femininity. But when women are constructing it, they look constructed as an evidence of thought and bored womanhood. They look upon these women as being idle, mindless, and they do not fit into any notion of the Western description of a usefulness of a housewife. I'll just read out few from the writings of some of these Western women. These poor ignorant women who have nothing better to do than sit cross-legged in carpets, drinking coffee, smoking and gossiping in one another. Another woman writes, they live in an animal state, eating and drinking and basking in the sun. Poor thing, they are greedy for a little amusement in their idleness. So, how we look upon women in history is something very important. We have really not moved away from those patriarchal notions of looking at women as a daughter, mother or wife, and they find it very uncomfortable to deal with women who are fighting for themselves and who are individual. Though we have so many examples, I gave you examples from the Bhakti movement where these women went out and tried to create a space for themselves. So the kind of gender construction continues right from ancient period to medieval period. Thank you very much.